into making math contextual, visual, and concrete. As we go, I'm going to be doing a task that's going to leverage the following tools. Now, you don't have to actually use these tools. If you don't like, you can actually draw out visual representations if you'd prefer. So feel free to go ahead and do that. However, this app can be used right in a new browser tab. Also, you've got an opportunity to use these manipulatives on an iPad. They aren't available on an iPhone because the screen just isn't large enough. So the ones we're going to be looking at today are from the Math Learning Center. And the two apps, either one will work here, but the two apps that I'm interested in looking at are number pieces. So either number pieces basic or just the straight up number pieces. Really the only difference is with number pieces basic, it's a little more user friendly. By default, the manipulatives are larger. So if you're a little younger or students struggling with their finger dexterity on the screen, they might want to choose basic rather than the regular number pieces on the right. All right, so again, we've got a link there if you want to open that up in a new tab using this really cool tool called Google. You could just type in Math Learning Center number pieces and it'll pop right up if you don't want to go ahead and have to actually refer to this big long link. My name is Kyle Pearce. I'm from Bell River, Ontario, just outside Windsor. We're in the deep south of Ontario, the most southern area of Canada. We're actually south of parts of 25, or actually it might be more than 25 US states. So go figure, right? You think Canada's above you if you're from the US, but actually not the case. So today what I want to talk to you about is a little problem that I had in my own math classroom. I think it's a problem we all deal with from K to 12. Probably more so as we get into the junior grades and up. But for me, in my first year teaching, I had to teach a really, really cool concept from data management. This was a grade 12 concept. We're not going to be doing grade 12 concepts today, so don't let this scare you, but this is just to share a bit of my own experience of teaching math. And what I had to do on one of these days when I was teaching that course is a topic called the correlation coefficient. If you look at this bad boy, it's pretty intimidating, not just for the students, but for the teachers who have to actually go ahead and teach this stuff. So I would drive to school every day thinking, like, how am I going to actually make this manageable for students, make them understand it, and also make them want to learn it? For me, it was a really cool formula because it actually helps you determine how strongly correlated two variables are. Now that's something that's really cool to me as a person who went through his post-secondary in math, but for my students, they typically would look back at me like this. So they were looking at me with these long faces, these sad, sad faces, and unfortunately, I was left to try to find ways to engage them. So what I thought I would do is try to make these really cool structured notes for them. I wanted to make math class as easy as possible. So here's something that you might have received if you were in my grade 11 college course. This was the first day of content. 1.1, why don't we go ahead and review fractions and percentages since everybody struggles in those. So I had nice structured notes. But what I realized was that wasn't actually engaging my students and it actually wasn't helping them understand the content. And what I came to realize is that my everyday framework for how I led math lessons was flawed. I was teaching the way I was taught. And unfortunately, all I was doing was putting a Band-Aid on the problems in math class. So I want to take you down sort of my own experience learning math. But also, I'm going to just come clean and say the majority of my career, I taught this way as well, because really it's the only thing I knew how to do. I had experienced it myself. It seemed to have worked for me because I actually got a math degree, but I do know that it didn't work for the majority of students in my class because many of them stopped taking math somewhere in the high school years. So first thing I would do is I would come into class and we would take up the homework, right? Seems like a noble thing to do. I want to make sure students understand what we're doing. If you're in elementary, I do want you to definitely consider this, the research around homework in elementary. So this is specifically how I taught a high school class. There are some benefits in secondary as to why we might give homework, but in elementary, really, if you are given homework, really think long and hard about what you're giving and how much you're giving, all right? Because that could definitely lead to student disengagement, especially in math class. So I would take up that homework. But this is the part that really, I really struggled with was, I felt as though I had to be the one to give all the steps, procedures, definitions, formulas, and algorithms to my students. Without me, they didn't know anything. And really, this is sort of how my math class sounded. Hopefully the volume will be loud enough for you.
Tells us that y equals 3x plus 2. This means that we can substitute a 3x plus 2 in for the y in our second equation. In other words, since y means the same thing as 3x plus 2, we can replace the y in the second equation with a 3x plus 2. And rewriting our second equation, we now have...
Whoa, okay, so that one, that meerkat almost went down. That looked like many of the students in my classroom. After I would teach this long drawn out lesson that students clearly weren't connecting with, when they're bobbing their heads and asking me, when will I ever use this? Clearly I have done something or haven't done enough to help them see the relevance of the math. I then proceed to move on to some examples, sometimes 2 examples, 3 examples, maybe 10 examples, because I wanted to make sure that everybody understood everyone understood the content. And unfortunately for me, I really wasn't going about it all that in a very engaging fashion. Here's a YouTube video that I put online that sounds probably an awful lot like what I would do in my math class with all my examples. I see 2 triangles, but more specifically, I see 2 isosceles triangles. So this particular triangle has 2 sides that are the same, and this triangle here has 2 sides that are the same. So these are key indicators that could help us further explain the problems. Whoa, really engaging stuff, I'm sure. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that we never do examples for students, because there's definitely a time and a place for us to actually guide students. We need explicit instruction in math class. And let's be honest, there's people that are actually looking to learn about things just like this particular topic. Like, people actually watched that and they were engaged. Like, I think the big difference is that when someone's looking for how to do something, you can teach it in a fairly bland way because you're offering them value. But unfortunately for the students in my class, they never asked to sit there. They didn't sign up to learn about angles in a triangle. They didn't do any of that. They've been forced to sit there. So as a teacher in K to 12, I really have to be thinking about how can I help students see the need and the reason why we want to learn this mathematics and see that beauty. And then finally, we'd wrap it up with, giving some more homework, and then we'd rinse and repeat and do it all over again. Unfortunately, though, when I use this lesson structure, what I found was, although I was scaffolding, like I was planning this out to try to make this as scaffolded as possible to ensure that no one fell off the wagon along the way. But unfortunately for some students, it's almost like the more I scaffolded, the more they disengaged with the lesson. And then we had situations like this one right here. You got kids, you're starting with something that really seems fairly basic, and then all of a sudden students start to disengage. They're like, this is too easy. I don't even want to pay attention anymore. Then they look up, and then you see this. And then they're completely done. They don't want to engage in that at all. So those students are walking out of the class, and they've really just decided that math class isn't for them. So despite my hard efforts to try to make math class as easy as possible, what I realized is that maybe that wasn't the right approach. The result for me was I ended up with 2 groups of students. I had students who were successful in math class, or at least perceived themselves to be successful, and I had some other students who were unsuccessful in math class. Now, you can imagine if in a student's mind they feel that they're successful in math class, they might actually go on to believe that I'm good at math. And the students who don't feel successful may develop the perception that maybe I'm not so great at math. students are going to get more confidence or maybe lose confidence, right? Become more doubtful, less likely to engage. So for teachers who are teaching in the junior grades where some students have decided that they're not math people, they're going to start disliking math, while the other students might actually like math more. They feel like, hey, I'm pretty good at this. They feel pretty good. And let's be honest, when you're good at something, you feel good about it. That might mean that I'm going to engage in my class, while students who are not enjoying that math experience are probably going to disengage. Some students are going to move ahead and some are going to move behind. And then we end up with these two groups of students. But my biggest issue that I found was that even those students in the good at math group and a good chunk of the students in that poor at math group had something in common. And I'm going to say it looked kind of like this. Like, my bubbles here aren't proportional by any means. It wasn't like it was a 50-50 split. Some years I had a lot of students who felt good at math. Other years I had lots of students who felt not so great at math. But I'm going to say that all the students in the poor at math group, as well as a good chunk of the students in the good at math group, have something in common. You'll see there's just a little slice there of students in the good at math group that don't fit into this common bubble here. I hope you note, math people here, I hope you note the use of a Venn diagram here in my presentation, all right? There's little math inserted along the way. But what I found was that lots of students in both groups struggled with unfamiliar problems. So I had students cruising along with an 80% in a class, but yet they couldn't actually solve a problem that I hadn't already shown them through an example or through a textbook problem. And that was a major concern of mine, because really, I didn't want them just memorizing my steps. I wanted them building their own resiliency, their own perseverance, and their own ability to solve unique problems. So that's where I came up with playing with this idea of how am I going to take my math class and how am I going to change things to make it better. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. This vision for math, to make math contextual and to make it visual and concrete wherever possible. And if we do that, we can help show how interconnected the math is. All right. Over time, if we start with that context, with the visual, with the concrete, what we can do is help students improve their confidence, right? Sort of find that confidence that they probably had when they were a young child, right? Children are very confident when they do things, but over time that goes away when I realize that, man, I'm not doing so great here and I'm constantly struggling. I want to change their perception of mathematics, and I think when we do those two things over time, we can actually address the student success piece. We can't address student success until we deal with those two first. So what I want to give you an opportunity to do here is I want to lead you through a task, because I believe there's not a better way to introduce a math concept to students. So this isn't, I haven't pre-taught anything. I want to introduce students through context, through visuals, and through the concrete, because that's where math began. We didn't make math and then try to figure out what it meant. We took the real world and we connected what math actually represents, that real world. So that's what we're going to do here today. So we're going to do a quick second to do a notice and wonder. Because of our little flip earlier, we might not be able to do a super long notice and wonder here. But if you are in the room, there is a chat along the side. So what I'm hoping we'll do in the chat pod is actually go ahead and jot down some of our noticings and wonderings. I see Peter's ready. He's in the chat. If you're in this and you've never been in a Hangout before, if you scroll your mouse over the screen and you'll see a column to the left, like a navigation bar, and you'll see a little blue box right up at the top, and it's the chat box. Click on that, and I see 13 viewers in the room right now. Hopefully more will join us as we go. So in that chat box, go ahead and, just so I know you're there, say ready. Go ahead and put in ready, because I'm going to be putting an image up on the screen for you guys to notice and wonder. I see Peter's ready. Let's see a few more. Hopefully you'll join us in this notice and wonder. All right, let's get going. Here is the image that I have for you. I'd like you to jot down, what do you notice and what do you wonder? So I see those 15 viewers. Hopefully we'll get a couple comments in there. and then we'll move along. So I'll give you guys about 30 seconds or so to do that, and then we're going to move forward. All right, Peter's noticing a whole bunch of donuts. Awesome. I definitely notice a whole bunch of donuts. If you'd like to join us in this chat, just in the top left corner of your screen, you'll see a chat box. Give that a click, and we'll have you join away. All right, in my classroom, I get students that come up with all kinds of ideas with this question. Peter's saying, how many are there actually? I get some students who say, how do they hold up that box? Like, is that like an actual a piece of plywood underneath? Like, is it a box over top of like a really strong support? Is there somebody under there holding up, propping up these donuts? How much does it weigh? Peter's saying, like, what's the perimeter of this box? Like, how many people could line up around that box to eat these donuts? You've got all kinds of ideas here. So you get the idea. With my students, what I want to do is give them an opportunity to be engaged in the math. And what we've done here is we've sort of forced everyone without having to force anything. We've almost manipulated students to understand the context of the problem before they even know what the problem's going to be. So I can take problems from my students, or what I can do is I might pick one from those students, and then maybe we come back to some of the others. So today, for this particular presentation, I've narrowed down to like, how many donuts are there? And I would give people an opportunity to make predictions. Because we're live here and because we had to switch the link earlier, we don't have a huge number of people in the room right now. So I'm going to just sort of walk through what that might look like, sound like in my classroom. At this point, I want them making predictions. So I want them sharing out those noticings and wonderings with their neighbors. I want to have them shared out to the class, but then I want them talking to their neighbors about a prediction. And I want them to articulate. I want them to use their adaptive reasoning skills in order to articulate why they believe there to be a certain number of donuts in there. You might have some students going with a gut shot, but what we're trying to push students towards, without being too forceful, because again, we want them to be a major player in this particular part of the lesson. I want them to try to articulate to me, like, where did you come up with that number? If you came up with 400, where did you come up with that number? Because that's the part I'm really interested in. I'm actually not interested in the actual number. I want to know, what was your thinking? I have some students using spatial reasoning skills to look at this particular box, and they see all those dots and they say, you know what? It almost looks like if you look at those dots like a diamond, each diamond, like each of those 4 dots together could be a donut. So some students might be like, well, so I think like on either side, there's like 3 or 4 donuts underneath that little white portion of the box. And then they can do the same on the top and the bottom. So you've got all kinds of different options. Peter's saying he thinks it's a 40 by 20. So that student might say, you know, there's 800. And I'd say, well, how do you know? And if they say, I think there's 40 columns and 20 rows, or vice versa, boom, that's great. Now I just learned a little bit about that student. You'll have some students who are going to pick less friendly numbers, and that tells you a little bit about where they are in their multiplication journey as well. So all good information here, and we'd have them share them out. I'd write them out on the board. This is like a Dan Meyer sort of style problem. I want to make sure with a 3-act math task that we're actually like pegging these predictions to student names, and then I would go ahead and give them some more information. So I might at this point say, bang, there's your actual dimensions. Go have at her. I want you to solve it using a concrete, visual, and some sort of symbolic representation. That might be what I ask. Now, I wouldn't do this on day one where they're like, what the heck is that stuff? But if I've used this idea of making it concrete, I would have my concrete manipulatives out. So in this case, I might be using base 10 blocks. For you folks, you could be using those digital manipulatives. But for students, I would say they definitely need to start with the concrete. Don't start them on the digital. They need to feel, touch, feel, and manipulate those actual tools in order to build a deep understanding. So I guess what I'm advocating here is, what I don't want to do is I don't want students memorizing how to do stuff in math class in order to engage in interesting math. What I want for my students is I do want students to explore interesting math to develop knowledge and understanding of math facts. All right, so whether that be multiplication like in this particular problem, or whether it be something complex like the correlation coefficient. Rather than me starting with that correlation coefficient like I did at the beginning of the presentation, if you weren't here, we looked at this bad boy, and that's how I would sort of teach it. I'd take that and unpack it. What I want to do is I want students to start with something interesting. In this case, we're talking about multiplication, so I want them to notice and wonder about this particular box. And if I'm doing multiplication, I want them to make predictions, and then we can get to the actual math. All right, so again, what I want is those students exploring interesting math in order to develop those skills. Okay, so we only have a few minutes left here. So what I want to do, I do want you to know that on my website, you can download this particular donut task as well as some modifications. And what I mean by modifications is if I'm in a JK class or a kindergarten class, SK, JK, SK class, I might start with a box like a regular box of donuts. Doesn't seem that interesting to you or I because I know there's 12 donuts in there. But to a student in kindergarten, they may not know how many donuts are in a box. I know my student, my kids wouldn't, and my daughter is 6. So this is something that we can work through with our students. They can still make predictions. They might say all kinds of crazy numbers because they're very young. But if we give them the opportunity and we give them visuals to work with to help them build their spatial reasoning skills, they can do things like this and they can update their prediction. How about now? Like, how many donuts do you see now? I see 8 donuts. Okay, so how many do you think there are in the entire box then? And then hopefully we can help them develop those skills. The idea that I'm trying to push here is that we should be starting with the concrete. And for really young children, that might mean actual donuts, right? Or if I have carrots, I might have to actually use actual carrots or pencils or whatever it is, or goldfish. And then over time, we can actually use manipulatives to represent the actual donuts. All right, so that would be like almost like a multiple stages in that concrete phase. And then over time, I want to move on to drawings and diagrams. Now, like I should restate that. I don't want to move on to drawings and diagrams. Students are going to want to move on to drawings and diagrams. So I don't want to force them there. I want to sort of get them to a place where they're suddenly going like, wow, do I really have to do this? So if I go back to the big donut box, do I really need to use base 10 blocks to do this? Or sir, could I like draw this out? Because like I think I've got a strategy that will work. And if they can draw it out, then I would say definitely go for it. But I don't want to skip that concrete stage. And then finally, we'll get to a place where we can go to the abstract. You'll notice that in the abstract stage here, I've been very explicit to show 3 and then groups of and words. That's still abstract to kids because they have to visualize what that means. So if I do things the way I did for years, which is like showing 3 times 4 with an X for my multiplication sign, that is like super abstract. Seems simple to you or I, but I've got to back all the way up here, and I really need to rethink how I want to do things. And we can use this idea of concreteness fading, and it doesn't fade forever. It fades for every concept, right? For every concept at every level of abstraction. Because when I come back to this problem in grade 4, I might have 3 boxes. And now students have to figure out like how many are in 3 boxes total. If they know there's 12 in one, well, we have double digit by single digit multiplication. So I'm pretty sure they'll be able to get to this answer here. You'll notice that I could do this concretely with donuts, or I might do this concretely with manipulatives. They might be at a place there where they can do that. They can use square tiles or maybe circular chips, like whatever they want to do. And then eventually they might just draw this thing out. Over time, we then move to that abstract stage once again. So I'm going to just model this for this level here. Like, again, it's a lot of donuts, but you know what? If a student's at that place, I might have to do that. I might maybe pick lower numbers as well. But then over time, we can use base 10 materials. And now I can chunk 10 of those donuts together, and I've got less pieces to work with. And I can almost see this happening like area, like I'm covering a certain amount of area. And within these stages, I have this algorithm living here. So if you can't see it, what you have in the left two representations is the distributive property taking place. The base 10 materials force distribution every 10 and every 1. So it's where you see those splits, you actually have the distributive property going on. So if I look at this first multiplication, this first partial product of 10 times 3 or 3 times 10, I end up with 30 or 3 10s, right? And over here, I've got 2 3s or 3 2s, and we end up with 6, and we have a total of 36. That's equivalent to something we do later when we use brackets. So I literally could be using brackets way earlier, at least intuitively I'm using brackets, but I've got to be explicit about it. And I would say if I am explicit about it, it might make more sense to start with the distributive property using brackets before actually moving on to the standard algorithm. So if I look at that and I switch that around, I think that might even be more intuitive along the way. So what I've tried to share with you here in this very, very short time together this morning is this idea of starting with context, starting with concrete, and then moving to visuals and the symbolic representation. Now, we have to sort of think about this in two different ways, because I can visualize the context just like we did earlier with my donuts, right? Remember my big box of donuts that we had here? All right, so that's visualizing the context, but I also need to be able to visualize the mathematics. All right, so there's sort of two pillars here to this idea of visualizing. So I've got two ideas sort of running in parallel here, and then we can get to the really interesting math. Now, I will show you what this will look like. If you see me scrolling on your screen, like to the side, you see all these slides. Like I've got lots of them, and they're all animated. So when this is live in person, this is a little bit more impactful. But because of time, I just want to share with you like what that would look like. Our donuts would look like using base 10 material. I've got my 100 flats there. I can see the multiplication of 10 by 10. That gives me 10 groups of 10 or 100 in total. And what I end up with is this beautiful area model, or call it array if you want, because it is arrays just chunked together. And what we end up with is an answer of 800 donuts. Now, a few other connections I want to make for you, all right? Not only would we show how many donuts there are, but I do want to make some connections that like understanding the math is so important. Like if you've been on Facebook like I have, I saw this thing called Japanese math or stick multiplication. And if you look at this base 10 materials and you just split them up and you just turn them sideways, if you've seen this before, you actually are seeing this Japanese math in action, all right? And what you're seeing is the intersecting points of these lines are showing the base 10 materials. And with those base 10 materials, I can actually do this math a whole lot easier. So if I look at what we've got here, we've got sort of a trick to multiply, but it's not a trick at all. It actually stems from this idea of concrete and visual representation. So I'm not advocating you teach students how to do stick math, but what I do want you to know is that every single trick that's out there has a very, very important meaning that underpins it. And what people on YouTube or on Facebook will try to sell you on is on these really cool tricks so that, you know, we can save time and effort. But for me, if students did run into this online, I would want them to try to figure out like, how does this thing actually work? Because really what you're looking at is, in fact, the standard algorithm for multiplication. All right, so the last couple connections I want to make for you, and I know we're just blazing through this, so I really apologize. I'm like not modeling how I want to teach with my students at all, because many people are probably sitting there going, what the heck just happened? So we definitely don't want to be flying through, you know, 6 years of math in our classroom. But I do want to make some connections just in case you are at an older grade level. For those who are like teaching in grade 6 and up, like multiplication can be extended from that base 10 model to see this open area model. And what we see here is students get to chunk their multiplication in different ways, however they want. And ultimately what you see here is the standard algorithm for math or for multiplication. So if I look at this and I multiply this out the standard way, I'm going to do it from left to right instead of right to left, sort of a James Tanton move. But if I look at 30 and 20, we see it in the algorithm. We often say 3 times 2 to keep the math simple. I disagree with that. I want to say there's 3 10s and there's 2 10s. How many 10s are there in total? 3 10s and 2 10s. Well, we're going to end up with, and when we multiply them, I should say, we're going to end up with 60 10s in total. All right, so, or 600s. And we're going to do the same thing over here. We can actually see this, this multiplication of 20 times 2, or 2 groups of 20. We end up with 40. And here we have 30 groups of 5, or 5 groups of 30. We end up with 150. And 2 groups of 5, we end up with 10. We put them all together. You'll notice that what we have is the standard algorithm, except I didn't carry a bunch of 1s or carry a bunch of 10s and so forth. Because really, the only reason that's useful is to save paper. So unless you're like on a huge paper crunch, I get it. We want to save the environment, but you know, for the reason of helping our students better understand the math, maybe we avoid that for now. And when students are ready, we show them that time-saving tool or that paper-saving tool of carrying all your 10s and so forth. So with that, yeah, you do end up with 800. Here's what like this might look like if we think about from concrete to symbolic. It might look like this. There's all kinds of mini stages in between as well. So I'm not going to suggest that you like, you know, leapfrog from these 3 representations only. But that is what it might look like in your class. Now there's some other extensions that I can't really make today. This does extend to algebra. This problem also has some extensions, really, really cool extensions, because I will tell you the box actually doesn't have 800 in it. You'll have to go to my website to see why. There's actually more than 800, so maybe you can ponder why that might be. But I do want you to know, like if you're a secondary teacher, like we can be doing this stuff with algebra. If I just tell you or say that I don't know how many are in the box, and I give you some information about it. So if let's say there's, you know, 8 boxes, and then I do tell you there's 6 in each box, I can do algebra and sort of show what this looks like. So this isn't going to be animated for us today, but you get the idea. So I've got another problem where we extend, where maybe I tell you how many are in all the boxes, and now you got to figure out how many are in an individual box. And this goes on all the way to grade 10 academic, where you can actually see factoring through this particular context. So this is all up on my website, just how we can take this and make it look more like that with algebra tiles. So if you're interested, definitely check out on my website. This is the Donut Delight task on tapintoteenminds.com. But at this time, I think it's about time for me to wrap up. But before I do, my message to you today is be a little bit more Prince. So think about Prince for a second. He became a symbol only after people saw him in the flesh. They actually experienced him in a concrete form. They started to, you know, buy visuals of him or seek out visuals of him online, whether it be through images, through posters, all kinds of different ways to see him if they couldn't see him in the flesh. And then and only then is when he moved to the symbol. So I'm going to argue that in math class, we tend to do the opposite. We tend to move from symbols and we try to unpack them and show how they connect to the real world. But what I'm asking you to do today is to think about how do we start in the concrete and how do we work towards the symbol to represent the things we already know from the world around us. So I do want to thank you so much for joining me today. We didn't get a chance to sort of completely pull apart that task, but I do hope that you saw that we started with task in order to make things contextual, visual, and concrete. I wanted to give you some inquiry time. We didn't actually engage in that inquiry time, but my students would be in the classroom. They're going to be doing the work. They're going to be doing the problem solving. I'm going to help them make connections and connect it to their prior knowledge so that we can consolidate to move towards procedural fluency. So with that in mind, all of this information is up on my website at tapintoteenminds.com. If you're interested in helping students learn math through exploring interesting problems in order to understand math instead of memorizing math in order to do interesting problems. Seek out Dan Meyer, as well as seek out Dan Meyer type problems called 3-act math tasks up on my website at tapinateenminds.com/3-act math. All right. I will post these links up on Twitter in just a moment. And as well, on my website, I have a 3-part video series. Video 1 is already out if you're interested in spiraling your math class. So all of those details are up on my website. If you can't find any of it, I know we just did this in a really short period of time. Reach out to me on Twitter. I'm Mathlete Pearce, or use the contact button on my website, tap it into Teen Minds, and do your best to describe what you're looking for, and I will do my best to try to help you find it. So I want to thank Peter and the team for inviting me to present today, and I hope you guys have an amazing day of learning online. I can't wait to dive into a couple more of these hangouts with you folks, so that we can all get better together. Thanks a ton, and I hope that we'll connect again online soon sometime.
Thanks, Kyle. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I'm actually seeing Peter saying Q&A. I totally forgot about the Q&A, so I will stick around if there's any Q&A from our 15 viewers in the room. And yeah, we've got some time for that. So if there are any, feel free to fire them into the chat box.
And you know what, Kyle, I'll just respond and say that you know, I like how you shared your whole journey as to, you know, how you used to or how you began teaching math. And I think we do that naturally. We become teachers and we become the teachers that we had. But, and I was there as well. And I was all about the textbook. And me personally, I call it, I see you're the concrete. I think of mine as giving students real world questions. And that came from literally ditching the textbook. I think for me, the textbook became the crutch, but it's what didn't allow me to innovate within the classroom. So once the textbook went away and I began looking for real world examples, is what I call it. I think you call them concrete. But you know, when you showed that donut question, it was perfect. That's the way I do it. But I like how you showed the progression is how you go from concrete, in my sense, real world, to the visual, symbolic, and the whole Prince thing. That was awesome. I love that. And that's what we need as teachers, that concrete strategy to do that. So my question then is, what would assessment and homework look like in your classroom, or in the classes of people who obviously have listened to you and have, you know, kind of taken on your model of teaching math? Obviously, you're not looking at end of unit tests.
Mm-hmm.
What would assessment look like, and perhaps homework?
Awesome, great questions, and I'll back up first, and I'm just plugging in here just so that we don't have any issue with feedback. So I apologize here, but yeah, no, I want to go back first to the textbook. I think ditching the textbook, as you mentioned, Peter, I think that's a huge move. But I do want to also mention that I would also suggest that teachers don't ditch it too soon if they're not ready to. So I think, you know, just like in math class, how there's like this progression, and I know you know that, but I just want to make sure that anyone in the room sort of doesn't sort of go like, I'm a first year teacher and I'm going to ditch the textbook starting tomorrow. And I know you weren't implying that, but that I think is the place you want to get to. So if that's the place I can get to, is, you know, maybe the textbook, you know, maybe I'm not fully ditching it right away, but maybe when I'm introducing new ideas, I'm finding ways to do it in interesting ways, right? Just like you said, whether you call it real world, whether you call it 3-act math, whether you know, there's all kinds of different approaches to do that. But use that as the foundation for the cognitive need, right? Like why we want to learn this stuff. And then you might look to your resources to help support you with, you know, how that might look like when I'm unpacking it or whatever. So I did want to clarify that, because I know that there's a lot of people out there that sometimes they sort of dive in and then, you know, they're out there and they're, you know, the life ring is like really far away and they're not sure what to do.
You know what? Can I just jump in for a second, Kyle?
For sure,
absolutely, 100%. And that people have to understand, when I say that, I've also been teaching grade 5 and 6 math for 23 years, started with the textbook, but like you said, it's a slow and natural progression to the point where I know the curriculum well. And I think it's important that we need to get across to teachers that we teach the curriculum, and the textbook, you know, if you know your curriculum well enough, the textbook also has many things in it, in concepts that we don't need to teach as well. So
absolutely,
yeah, 100%. And I will say that it's a progression.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And you know, like you said too, yeah, knowing what we need to teach, and that's a challenge too for anyone who may be new to a grade, for example, because there's a lot of stuff in there. But you're right, yeah, knowing what you need to teach, because oftentimes teachers will say, I ran out of time, but the reality was, well, you sort of did that because you taught ideas that were in a textbook that didn't need to be there, right? Publishers sort of, you know, try to minimize costs, and they, you know, they'll even give you more than you need, just so that they can meet multiple province expectations or state standards, whatever it might be, right? So yeah, that's a great point.
And I also, sorry, one other thing too, I also want to say, like, by following the textbook from front to back, it sometimes it just doesn't work. Like, you know, if I'm thinking of transformational geometry, to spend 2 days doing translations and slides, maybe your kids, they get slides right away. And, you know, so then you go into rotations and reflections. Like, I do them all, like, to start with. And so it has to feel right for your class. And I think every year, depending on the group of kids that you have, you teach it a little bit differently based on their needs too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to address your question around homework and assessment, for example, in that spiraling series that I had mentioned at the end of the slides there, I do go into assessment a little bit in video 2 and video 3. And for me in my class, I look at assessment as check-ins. So whether you call it, I've called them all kinds of different things, but I find if you call it a test or if you call it an assessment, then students immediately, whether you intend it to be that way or not, your vision of what that means might be different. But for a student, they remember what it meant all the way through school. So by the time they get to me in grade 9, 10, 11, or 12, and in 11 and 12, things do change. We're going to be getting closer to the real world, and, you know, post-secondary, like, you're getting closer to the big time, right? So I totally understand in 11 and 12, you're going to go to a place where now we're going to say, okay, we want you ready before an assessment, just like you got to be ready for your, you know, I got to be ready for this presentation this morning. You know, people aren't as forgiving in the real world. So there is this progression there as well. But at least to grade 9 and 10, from, you know, the earlier we are all the way to 9 and 10, I think we need to keep kids engaged by giving them assessment as check-ins, as, you know, an update of where they are. So for me, it turned into once a week. I know John Orr does the same thing. Craig Guthrie does the same thing at Tecumseh Vista Academy in grade 8 and his grade 7 classes as well. He does a few different math classes. And what we try to do is we try to give them feedback through learning goals, or whether it's standards-based grading, whatever whatever you choose to assess by. For us, we called it learning goals. That was our criteria for assessment. And students knew that every single assessment, every week on a Tuesday, we did our check-in. Some people call it mastery day. Some people call it whatever they want. Kids knew they were going to get a handful of problems, 4 to 6. Some might be from the past week, and then some are going to be from earlier in the year. So there's no cramming. There's no like, hey guys, study for the test tonight. Like, when we tell kids to study for tests the night before, what I think we're telling them is we're like, we don't want them to do poorly because it looks bad on us. So go home and do the work. And I get, like, studying's great. Like, we need kids to do that, especially in secondary as we move up. But from K to 9, for example, I mean, they're kids. Like, we need them to be doing some stuff on their own time, but it's got to be meaningful. And I don't want it to be cramming, because the reality is, if they know how to multiply fractions today in grade 8, well, 3 weeks from now, they probably won't, because they probably didn't learn it conceptually, and they probably didn't really have a grasp on it anyway. They were just using short-term memory. So for me, an assessment is just that. Where are you? And then we take the results of that to inform our instruction moving forward. So this week coming up, I might have to change what I had thought I was going to do, because guess what? Kids don't know how to do Pythagorean theorem anymore, or they don't know how to do double-digit multiplication anymore because we haven't done it in such a while. So I think we align definitely on the assessment front based on what I've read on your blog, but I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on that.
100%. You know what? I sometimes find that it's a small tweak in a word. We say test, assessment. We have grade 3 and 6 assessment, EQAO. There's a stigma to that. Whereas I've changed assessment and test to SWIC, show what I know. And that, I mean, the kids get excited about it. Mr. C, are we doing SWIC today? Yeah, you get to show what you know. And you're showing what you know and where you're at this point, so I can help you move ahead. So it's not, they don't have to get perfect. They're showing their work, where they're at, and I do that as well. I kind of scaffold in questions from the past. Sometimes, you know, if we're working on a concept, say for example, fractions, decimals, and percent, and I'm spiraling as well, but that in itself is a journey.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's incredibly important, and has made a big difference in my math classroom. So, and agree again, 100% that no, you shouldn't be going home and studying for a test. And there's that danger right now with grade 6 test coming. We have, depending on where we're at in our teaching careers, you know, are we going to spend the next 3 weeks preparing our students for the test? I think they should be prepared to show what they know by the end. And so, you know, there's a concern that I think about running a marathon. If we're having our kids run the marathon for 3 weeks before actually the marathon, they're going to be done. So, you know, teachers who are now using EQAO practice text booklets and hammering the kids with those right now, or, you know, printing up the test reviews, there's a danger in that. And I think it takes all the fun out of learning, and it becomes a stress. And what about those kids then that get, you know, their mark back and they get a level 2? What message are we sending them? So for me, it's show what I know. It's become a math portfolio. So they have a portfolio of their learning. I've broken it down into 5 strands where they have 5 different folders, and their paper SWICs go within those strands. And it's right there in front of me and them. And then we also use Google Classroom, and Flipgrid is incredibly powerful for showing, having the kids just be able to articulate what they know. And then I can be, for me, my assessment is being present in their learning. So I'm also assessing not just their SWICs, but being present every day in their learning. I'm using a phone, dictating where I see, you know, where we need to go next. It has to be a really fluid process.
Yeah, it's funny because, you know, you mentioned the EQAO thing, and again, I think the information we can glean from EQAO, if it was used appropriately, which unfortunately it's not, right? The way the media uses it and the way we as districts often react to, you know, to those results. Really, it's supposed to tell us like where we are. It's not supposed to, you know, change individual classrooms, right, on that level. But you know, I look at it, and I used to do that. Like, I remember being that teacher in grade 9, applied and academic, and yeah, like we were all there, and I did it for the majority of my career. But in recent years, what I realized was, why am I changing how I'm teaching every day to do something like that, like this 3-week, you know, craziness? Maybe if I actually help my kids understand the math from day 1, I would be preparing them for that test all the way through. Because to me, I truly do believe that if I'm helping students get from that concrete all the way to the abstract over the course of my entire school year, the EQAO is the abstract in many cases. They do provide diagrams in some cases. So if I help them become math learners, and I help them become problem solvers, it doesn't become about like, make sure they're ready for this type of problem on the EQAO. Now it's like, it's a problem to solve, you know, and I would embed those problems throughout the school year as a warm up, or as a, you know, but only after we've done something interesting with that idea. Like, I want students to be able to go back and go, oh yeah, so this problem reminds me of the donut problem, or it reminds me of these different things. So and then there's less of an issue with the engagement piece. So a lot of people will come back and say that, or think that, okay, so Kyle probably never does word problems in his class, and that's completely untrue. It's not worth presenting on, right? I'm not going to do a presentation on word problems because they're not all that interesting. Like, we don't like them just like kids don't like them. But there's some great word problems out there. And EQAO problems are actually really good problems from a mathematical perspective. They might not be super engaging, but the actual tasks are so well designed. Like, they're way better mathematically designed to address mathematical ideas than the tasks that I create. So why am I not using them throughout my course when appropriate, rather than, bunching them over a 3-week span in booklets, right? I don't want my kids to know that those came from EQAO. I want them to just be intrigued by this other problem. And I could still use these elements of curiosity to try to spice them up a little bit, right? Covering things up and, getting them to notice and wonder just on the diagram, or like all of those elements can be put in there. And then we can make EQAO more of this thing that's just like, oh, we do it at the end and it's just another check-in, because really that's all it really is again. And it lets me know where I'm at. And if I'm at a level 3 or better, that's awesome. And if I'm not, well, let's go back and see, did you improve from grade 3 to grade 6 or 6 to 9? Like, if you were a 2.1 in grade 3 and you're a 2.5 now in grade 9, you improved. Like, imagine we actually did that as a province to celebrate improvements instead of just looking at that benchmark, right? If you got all these kids trying to hop over this fence and they're getting closer, they're higher up on the fence, but nobody seems to care about it, right? So that would be something that I'd like to try to push anyway.
And that's how I feel about the provincial assessment as well. I mean, it's about, and having done it for 22 years, what about all those students who have climbed so far? We should be celebrating that. Absolutely. And when those schools who get pitted as they're low achieving, you have to step inside of a school to understand their learning culture. And so I think Carol Campbell's report is a step in the right direction. It's just how the government responds to it. But those are things that are sometimes out of her hand. But what I love is that Carol is collected the thoughts and the ideas of people around the province. And I just want to add as well that preparing for the test, and I was there as well, and this is why I speak passionately about it. I prepare my students. It's how you perceive the test. Actually, I'm having a panel discussion on preparing for the test at 7 p.m. It's how you perceive the test. I think preparing for a test, my test is the test of life, and part of that is being able to write an assessment. And so, yeah, the kids are more than ready for the test, and their mindset going into the test is great. And you know what? My kids do very well on the test, but I don't celebrate that. I celebrate the fact that they're a group of learners, and being able to make the connections to the concrete, Kyle, I think is incredibly important as well. And so I want my kids to have fun learning, seeing that math happens in the real world. And you're right, when they get to an EQAO test question on transformational geometry, they're thinking, I hear them say, oh, this is when we did the mat problem in our class, because we have mats within our classroom that we use as just an area to sit. And so I have a pile of mats. And so we transform those mats throughout the classroom on a daily basis. Sometimes we turn them, sometimes we translate them.
Totally. Because those dots, they all represent something, right? I mean, as you were talking about the EQAO thing, like, I feel like we could take this slide and just modify the words to say the same thing, right? Like, why is EQAO there in the first place? It's not like, I think oftentimes we misinterpret and go like, we're doing all this work to do well on EQAO, when at the end of the day, we're not. That's not what the EQAO is there as, something like almost like a byproduct of, if we actually do the math and we do interesting things with it, students will be able to do all kinds of random problems on that EQAO assessment. So you know, it sort of jumped out at me as you were saying that. I thought it was you know, I thought that was sort of a nice connection that we could make there for sure.
100%. I appreciate that. And I think more conversations like we're having we're slowly changing. And the beautiful thing here is that we're supporting one another. There's teachers now throughout the province, really throughout the world, that, you know, I think about just how much that I've learned from your presentation that I'll take back to my classroom. It reinforces some of the stuff that I'm doing. And I think, it's a matter of certain tweaks. And so when it comes to the EQAO assessment, and don't get me wrong, my job as a teacher is also to prepare them for that test, and they are well prepared. Because when they go into it, it's simply just another opportunity for me to show what I know. So.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, I think that's where we'll make, you know, we'll move forward as a province if we could get to a place where, you know, because I'm actually scared if we take the test away in grade 3, and even possibly in other grade levels. They talked about grade 9 as well. Like, if we do that, I just worry about immediately the misunderstanding from the public would be like, they're too scared, you know, like we can't fix this or whatever it is, so we're just going to eliminate it. And the same goes for the curriculum. I think the curriculum needs to be revamped. There's so many missing pieces in between that need to be more explicit. But I sort of want to leave it for now, because I think as a province, like, we have the teaching power and we have the knowledge. We have so many educators that are just starting to figure this stuff out, right? Like, there's still tons of things I don't understand that I taught for years. You know, I taught it, but I don't really understand it. I'm not sure how I can help a student better understand it. So like, I sort of want the province to give us a chance to do that, so that we can see the trajectory change. Because I think, and again, but the trajectory changing on that EQAO result, because we're caring less about the EQAO and more about what we do in our classroom. Because again, that's supposed to just determine or help us determine, like, where are we? And like, are we moving in a good direction? So I would love to see that happen first before we made some of those changes, because I just worry about, you know, the media backlash that will come from it, right?
Yeah, I agree 100%. And you know what? That's why I love Carol's report. I think testing in grade 3 is too young. I agree. She has Dr. Jean on there. She's saying it as well. So, you know, grade 6, I think they looked very carefully at that. I get that. It's just, what is the purpose of EQAO? I think that's what we really need. Who's using it? Who cares? Because I can tell you, it doesn't do much for me to assist me as a teacher. In fact, the focus on EQAO and the way that I used to focus, I actually think it made me a worse teacher, because I taught to the test. Yeah, you know what? 70% of my kids in math and 85% in language, they scored 3 and above, and I celebrated that. But I think about, you know, the 25-30% of the kids who didn't. Some of them stopped coming to school because they're so disengaged by some of the stuff that maybe I was even doing in the classroom. So my concern is, what about those kids? What is the test doing to our most disadvantaged kids? And that's, I think, where everybody understands that there's a problem. And I've never said, no, let's take it away. Let's just make it better. Let's create something that will be valuable to me as a teacher. I can tell, like, when it comes to June, I know where my kids are at.
Right. You could probably determine without handing out the test who's going to do what, right? Because you know your kids, right? So I completely agree with you on that. And you know, a lot of me thinks getting rid of the whole thing would be fine, because I agree with you. I don't see it. I see it keeping people focused on math, but that's what it's supposed to do. Like, it's supposed to keep us focused on math, but there's all these other bits and pieces there that aren't being, you know, aren't very useful anyway, right? And the negative side effects of that, right? Like do we have to make it public? Like, why do we have to make it public for, you know, for at a school level, let's say? Like, why can't it be at a district level? You know, why do we have to have kids in grade 6 write for a week straight, right? And grade 3, same thing. Like that's a little bit over the top in my opinion, for sure.
Are they focused on math, or are they focused on the test? That's the other concern, right? And there's, I think it needs to change. It's just how it changes, because I can tell you, if people are focused on the test, then yes, they're going to focus on math and language. But in grade 3 and 6, I can tell you personally that people stop focusing on the other important subjects as well, like the arts and science and social studies, because I have to have my kids ready for the test. And
yeah, no, totally. I know the negatives definitely sound like they outweigh the positives, especially in elementary. You know, I come from that secondary side, so I see, you know, and I see the negatives in secondary as well. But definitely the younger we are, I think the sooner we sort of label the students formally, right? I mean, report cards are another labeling that I think needs to be addressed in some way. But yeah, it's something that at least we are looking at. And like you said, I think that report is going to at least get us thinking more deeply about where we go next with it anyway.
It's a step in the right direction for sure. And that's funny, actually, Kyle, because this conversation actually is something that I was hoping would come out in my conversation, our panel at 7 p.m. tonight, which is preparing for the test. So you're welcome to join me again.
Awesome.
If you haven't had enough of Mad PD already. But you know what? It looks like it's a great day. I haven't now followed the hashtag for a bit, but if the presentations are anything like yours, which I know they will be, this is what it's all about. We're making a difference collectively for our kids. So I want to thank you personally for sharing everything that you do in math and just leading the charge. So thanks again, Kyle.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter. I'm wishing you luck at 10. And yeah, if I'm back, we've got a family dinner this evening. If I'm back in time, I will definitely hop online to join you, because I definitely love learning the different opinions about how we can make this thing better called EQAO. So thanks for joining me this morning, and thanks to everybody who's still in the room. Hopefully, yeah, I think it's going to be a great day, and I hope I have a chance to dive into a couple other sessions and you know, see what everybody else is up to.
Yeah, you know what? I got to go finish my notes for the 10 o'clock, which is mine. It's not homework; it's home share, and nice. We never even got to talk about homework, but I think again, the small tweaks in the terminology will kind of change our mindset. So for me, it's the kids are going home and sharing what they have learned in math, or they're looking for concrete examples in math in their own homes and discussing it with their parents. So
that's awesome. That sounds great, my friend.
All right, Kyle.
Okay, well, we will sign off. Thanks to everybody for coming out. I'm going to post this link up. I'll send it out to Twitter there, because we had a little link mix up this morning. My apologies, but yeah, let's keep the learning going. So thanks for having me.
And we'll make sure that your new link gets on our Flipgrid landing page too.
Beautiful. Thanks a ton, guys.
Thank you, Kyle.
Have a good one, Peter. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
All right, see you later, everybody. Bye-bye.